Okay, so hello everyone, and I wish you all a warm welcome on behalf of our institute. And as we're about to host this year's first lecture within our annual seminar, Horizons of Freedom, and I'm really thrilled to welcome Professor Joe Shaw, a distinguished scholar of European law, constitutional law, and citizenship, and someone who published extensively on these subjects. And also for many years, she was running a project on transformation of citizenship regimes in the former Yugoslav states. So she's someone whose work is really important and valuable for us and for the regional studies here. Most recently, she published with the Bristol University Press, The People in Question, a book where she stresses the importance of taking a broad perspective on the constitutional dimensions of citizenship, looking beyond national boundaries. She currently holds the chair of European institutions at the University of Edinburgh and the part-time chair at New Social Research at Tampere University in Finland. And today's topic is the paradoxes of citizenship in the pandemic. And I believe that I'm not the only one excited to hear more about how this pandemic impacted and interacted not only with our legal statuses and rights, but also with our understandings of equality and dignity as fundamental principles of citizenship. So the questions of which norms constitute a good citizen or responsible citizenship in the times of pandemic. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Professor Shaw. Joe, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jelena. It's always a delight to interact with your institute in Belgrade. I've done it on numerous occasions in person, and it's somewhat sad, but in other ways quite liberating to be doing it this way in times of the pandemic, and to welcome people not just from the always very interesting Belgrade society, if you will, academia and so on, and broader society, to come to your institute for an in-person lecture, but also to welcome people from different spheres and so on and so forth who are interested in discussing this question. And it's quite nice, quite liberating also to do it on the Zoom meeting rather than on Zoom webinar, which is useful. And I often sit and ride my spinning bike whilst listening to things on Zoom webinar, because it doesn't require a lot of attention, but it's nice to have the slightly more intimate frame of Zoom meeting in order to discuss these important questions. So I'm going to share my screen for a PowerPoint presentation, and I hope that this will work. Okay, yep, that's all set. Yeah, it's as it should be, Jelena, is it? Yeah, good. Okay, so I prepared an abstract which Jelena, in a sense, briefly highlighted when she introduced me, and I'm going to look at some aspects of some ongoing work that I'm doing around citizenship and the pandemic. And unsurprisingly, I'm inspired in that work, if you will, by the book that I wrote, which is sitting next to me on this desk, as it always does. But broadening my concerns a little bit wider, to try to think about some other questions that the pandemic raises. So the first question I'm going to ask is the obvious one: is who's the pandemic citizen? That's the person who claims, in classic David Held terms, full membership under pandemic conditions. Under these conditions, The question is whether we can rely upon constitutional citizenship to do some of the membership work in our modern polities in order to distinguish on a principle basis between insiders and outsiders. Now, I've written an entire book about constitutional citizenship, and somebody asked me the other day whether or not I might be able to write an encyclopedia entry summarizing what constitutional citizenship is. And I guess I probably ought to try. But what I'm trying to say with constitutional citizenship is that I'm firstly trying to interpret and observe and describe the different ways in which constitutional law and citizenship, constitutions and constitutional law and citizenship interact with each other. That's looking at the places where they meet. Now, that isn't just in circumstances, perhaps most famously the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution, where there's a very clear definition of the natural born citizen. Well, I think it's quite clear, but it still seems to raise masses of debate. But it's more generally where, for example, citizenship, although just mentioned in Constitution, is then interpreted in the light of wider principles such as equality and dignity. Now, citizenship is this highly problematic concept within our modern polities. It's really not some sort of fundamental moral commitment. It's an artifact of government. It's the way that we make modern bounded or semi-bounded polities or states or other types of communities. It's the way that we make them work by distinguishing between the insiders and the outsiders. Now, that's not necessarily an ethical thing to do. On the contrary, it may be the ethical choice to be more inclusive and less exclusive. But nonetheless, under the conditions that we live in at present, in which states remain dominant actors within our life worlds, it's important to remember that it's important to accept, if you will, that citizenship is going to be around for quite some time, even though we might find that in a sense it disappoints just as frequently as it rewards with its problematic dimensions. States often treat citizenship simultaneously as both constitutionally really significant, almost sacred, and demand some sort of reverential attitude towards it. But at the same time, states treat citizenship as ethically fungible. That is, many states accord the capacity to become a citizen to, for example, those who invest a certain amount of money, or those who are descended from citizens, even if they have no real connection or genuine link to the polity that's granting them citizenship. And when state citizenship comes along with other advantages, such as EU citizenship, as in the case of Hungary, which gives citizenship quite readily to those who are who claim descendants, who claim a Hungarian connection. When it comes along with EU citizenship, that's a very significant advantage for those who otherwise would not have access to EU citizenship. So the problem with constitutional citizenship is that it's a messy arena in which we find lots of different, often contradictory principles. But if there's a normative claim that I make with my argument about constitutional citizenship, it is that although citizenship may be a flawed concept, it may be the best tool that we have to allow us to use principles such as equality and dignity as reference points. So what of citizenship under pandemic conditions? And these are not, as it were, points about citizenship directly, but they're the contexts in which citizenship is changing as a consequence of pandemic conditions. But they pose to us, I think, always a set of questions and and often quite contradictory demands, rather than just, if you will, a linear exposition of what the consequences of the pandemic are for citizenship. So, for example, with all the travel restrictions that we can see in the world, are we seeing the wreck of globalization? Or on the other hand, with the need for the free flow of vaccines and the way in which vaccine production is organized transnationally, not to mention the moral imperatives of ensuring the flow of vaccines to lower income countries, are we seeing, in fact, that the pandemic is reinforcing an enhanced need for global cooperation? Are we seeing, in relation to the impact of the pandemic on citizenship, the resurgence of the state? That is, we're relying on the state. Now, the one bit of the state, for example, in the UK that has worked quite well has been the rollout of vaccines, which is a function of two aspects of the state, a universal centralized healthcare system, the NHS, alongside the use of the army in order to facilitate the delivery of vaccines very effectively. Or are we looking into a dominant extent at the privatization of key state functions, thus hollowing out, if you will, the idea that citizenship is a public function as opposed to simply an aggregation of our private lives, if you will? And the UK is a good example of that. The bit of the UK's response to the pandemic that has worked least well has been where key state functions have been privatized, notably in the area of test and trace, which has been privatized and contracted out to large service companies, many of which are creaming off enormous profits at the expense of the British taxpayer. The third question is whether or not, you know, the pandemic, in terms of our position, as it were, as political citizens, is seeing the dominance of politics or of science, of expertise, or of political decision making. And clearly the two have to go hand in hand, except, of course, that one should caution that in many respects, in far too many examples that one could give, post-truth politics has come to the fore. I went to a webinar a few weeks ago about the dominance of conspiracy theories, especially in the Western Balkans, where many citizens adhere to various conspiracy theories about the nature of the disease, about where it came from, what the consequences of various therapies are, and of course in relation to the question of vaccination. Are we seeing, with the development of changes in relation to citizenship, are we seeing the resilience or the weakness of institutions and citizens? Are we seeing the pandemic reinforcing existing weaknesses or providing opportunities for resilience? I think that question is open, and we probably would need to have a great deal more empirical research in order to discuss that in detail. One could speculate about it at this moment. What I think more than anything else, and this is what I'll predominantly discuss in my presentation, is that we can see the re-engineering of the social meaning with significance for citizenship, and I talked about that in the somewhat the somewhat pompous abstract which I gave you, which I'll come on to later on. So what is the extent of the impact of the pandemic on citizenship? Well, I've spent far too much time over the last 6 months or so trying to track this and describe it, and I've got far too much material which I'm actually thinking about presenting in the form of a short book or possibly several linked articles. But what I'm going to present in detail today is one part of that. And two such questions concern whether or not the impact of the pandemic on citizenship is just practical changes like online citizenship ceremonies, delayed birth registration, postal voting, And that's clearly one of the ways in which the pandemic has affected citizenship. Or another way that one could look at it is to see whether it's operated as a boost to populist and other authoritarian urges to distinguish the true people from the outsiders. Part of a more general phenomenon, I think, of the shrinking of civic space in which citizens can be active and activist. And there's a certain amount of evidence of, say, bans on protests and so on, giving rise to potentially boosting the populist urge. And that is one of the very important questions that I've been asking in the writing that I've been doing on this. But one of the factors, this is a slight, as it was, sidestep, but one of the factors that really influenced me when I started to look at the pandemic in detail was a concept of the syndemic, which is a concept that's known particularly in medical anthropology and more generally in some of the sort of social biomedical sciences, if you will. A syndemic involves a set of enmeshed and mutually enhancing health problems that, working together in a context of noxious social and physical conditions, can significantly affect the overall disease burden and health status of a population. To put it another way, we can see that the pandemic is not an equal opportunity pandemic. It clearly affects certain groups much more substantially because they may be more likely to catch the disease, or if they catch the disease, they may be at greater risk of severe illness. And there are a variety of reasons for that, of course, which relate to age, social poverty, racial and ethnic background, and so on and so forth. And unsurprisingly, the same person, Meryl Singer, who coined the term syndemic, has suggested that the COVID-19 pandemic should be seen as a syndemic. We have to consider not just biological issues, but the social structural forces that propel disease interaction, population vulnerability, unequal healthcare, access to healthcare, including COVID-19 vaccines. And we can clearly see that is in place. And that thinking about the idea of the pandemic, not just, if you will, as a sort of medical thing that is happening, but as a complex social structure, in the same way that citizenship is a complex social structure, has really influenced the way in which I've tried to think out some of those problems, and has led to me picking out the specific issue that I want to concentrate on for the rest of this presentation, which is rethinking certain aspects of social behavior in the context of the pandemic. I want to provide a focus on how certain social acts are reconstructed as a part of citizenship in the context of the pandemic. I've got two case studies in what I've been writing, but there's definitely only sufficient time for one of them here, and I'm going to cover the first one, face coverings and masks. I'm not going to discuss public protests against restrictions on liberties imposed in the name of combating the virus. But if you wanted to sit here for most of the afternoon and the evening, then we would have time to do that. But unfortunately, I think it's probably the case that most people have more important things to do than sit here and listen to me. So that's where I'm just going to come briefly back to my slightly over pompous abstract and just review that again, because it provides a good introduction to the issues that are here, and which I'm going to unpack by providing some examples. So what I said in the abstract was, by exploring how the meaning of certain social acts has been shifting under pandemic conditions, we can gain new insights into the character of constitutional citizenship and its relationship with political ideas such as populism and fundamental principles such as equality and dignity. These shifts illustrate the changing meaning of what constitutes the good citizen, all the time playing on what Jean Cohen terms the paradoxical dialectic inherent in modern constitutionalism, at least within bounded polities, which, quotes, drives Republican or liberal democratic conceptions of citizenship into the arms of thicker, more communitarian understandings of identity. This then raises the question of whether it's feasible and reasonable to place a brake upon such trends and to ask which types of norms and institutions at the national and international levels are suitable for that task. So I'm going to concentrate on aspects of mask wearing in the pandemic. So certain items of clothing or personal accessories and behaviors have gained over time an intense and often problematic relationship with the rules governing the acquisition of citizenship and with the practice of good citizenship more generally. These practices have often been related to the disciplining of minority religious beliefs, such as prohibitions on wearing the burqa or the niqab in public, both of which cover the faces of those who wear them. In most European countries, or in places like Canada or the US, these garments are worn by only a small number of women of Islamic faith. As an example of the disciplining effect of norms related to the wearing of these garments, the wearing of a niqab has been used as the basis for the refusal of French citizenship on the grounds of insufficient assimilation into French society. Furthermore, a Moroccan man who had insisted that his wife should wear the niqab was also denied naturalization in France. A different argument was mooted in the context of a short-lived Canadian policy requiring women not to wear the niqab at their citizenship ceremonies, namely the importance of being unveiled and visible at a public ceremony. The relationship between this argument and the religious freedoms and gender equality protected in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms has never been tested in the Canadian courts, as the measure in question was struck down on the grounds that it was adopted unlawfully by a minister exceeding his powers. Not dissimilar to rules on clothing which covers the face are rules requiring handshakes as a compulsory element of citizenship ceremonies, which have been introduced in countries such as Denmark, France, and Germany. These measures have led to those who will not on religious grounds shake hands with members of the opposite sex being refused citizenship. Measures which link items of clothing, wearable accessories, and certain human behaviors to restrictions on citizenship acquisition form one element of a larger framing of the idea of the good citizen by reference to such visible coordinates. The application of restrictions behind these coordinates in societies where Muslims represent a minority and where they are overwhelmingly of recent migrant descent has been used as the basis for asserting that certain types of dress are outside the norm. Bans on wearing burqas or niqabs in public have been enacted in a number of countries, most famously in France, in that case on the back of an earlier measure prohibiting the display of symbols of religious faith in public schools, which obviously had a broader scope. And I'll pause there to note that in Switzerland, there will soon be a referendum, a national referendum on the wearing of the burqa during the pandemic. The latter measures have generally been justified on the grounds of maintaining a secularist and republican ethos against encroachment from all faiths. But like any other measure which could interfere with an element of religious freedom, even if couched in ostensibly neutral terms, can be contested on human rights grounds, and especially on the grounds of the protection of minority religious belief. This links these policies very clearly to issues of constitutional citizenship, so far as regards the contestation of freedom between the state and particular, often minority groups. Are these matters for legislative majorities or for courts as non-majoritarian institutions, perhaps using fundamental rights norms to adjudicate? Now, different groups, different courts and court-like institutions have approached these things in different ways. But the French courts and the European Court of Human Rights have both upheld the argument that the wearing of the burqa in public can be banned on the grounds that it undermines the value of living together. So in these sorts of cases, it can certainly be contended that in the context of France and other European countries that have enacted and enforced burqa bans and similar laws, the question of what types of clothing are worn by tiny minorities of Muslim women become a proxy for a widespread fear of Muslims as racialized and threatening others. French Muslims on that account find themselves defined almost exclusively in terms of a fixed and rigid religious identity, which is constructed as incompatible with the Republic, our values, equality between women and men, etc. The complex identities of these groups are thus faced with a totalizing and hegemonic majority culture, which affects the exercise, acquisition, and content of citizenship from the constitutional level downward, and reconstructs concepts of equality and dignity in complex ways. I would also note that the wearing of face coverings by groups of Muslim women needs to be seen in the broader context of the many varied and cultural encounters between constitutional norms and the idea of the mask. Such encounters have been a recurring theme throughout human history. Cultural and religious norms and legal provisions have been in place at different times and in different places to ban, dissuade, to encourage, and to mandate the wearing of different types of masks. Public opinion forms in favor of or against mask wearing, often as a result of so-called moral panics. This is evident as soon as we consider forms and practices of masking as diverse as plague masks in medieval times, premised on the incorrect theory that the disease was spread by miasma. The practice of mask wearing during the 1918-1920 flu pandemic, which correctly targeted flu as a respiratory airborne disease, and recent bans on wearing so-called hoodies or other items of clothing that may conceal identity on the grounds that these allegedly foster antisocial behavior. Among social scientists, perhaps anthropologists have been those who have looked most extensively at mask wearing and have noted that the mask and associated practices have been marked by deep ambivalences across time, space, across history. And this is certainly evident from the study of the relationship between mask wearing and citizenship in the context of COVID-19. New norms relating to the wearing of face coverings have disturbed settled conceptions of what or who is the good citizen and good citizen behavior in ways that could and perhaps should lead to the reconsideration of the paradoxical elements of measures such as the burqa ban. In many countries now, rules state that we should all, subject to exemptions for health and other reasons, wear face coverings and forsake conventional greetings such as handshakes, hugs, and kisses in favor of elbow bumps and Japanese-style bowing. Those who reject those new conventions often argue against such measures on grounds of freedom from state interference. It seems that the concept of the good citizen may now have partly switched around, with the wearing of a face covering and the refusal of bodily contact denoting those who have learned the new norms of behavior. What is curious to see is that it's members of majority and dominant social groups, above all within many societies, who are refusing such COVID-19 disciplines. Whereas in the earlier cases about burqas, niqabs, and handshaking, it was members of minority groups who clashed with imposed majority norms, which frequently ate the classic populist division of the people into them and us, even where imposed by ostensibly secular and liberal governments. Even in the short time since the appearance of the disease spread by the novel coronavirus, the story of masking as a protective measure against COVID-19 transmission has passed through several periods of contention and contestation that we can all remember, the argument that we were depriving healthcare workers of PPE, that no one was going to do this because it's primarily associated with the countries of East and Southeast Asia, and so on and so forth. We moved through all sorts of steps in relation to the wearing of masks. But it was perhaps the successful early adoption of mask mandates by countries such as the Czech Republic and Slovakia, which seemed to avoid the worst impacts of the first wave of infections, which was what resulted in the gradual and now widespread adoption of often homemade mask, face coverings in public places. Thus, after a lot of convulsion around mask wearing, in non-healthcare situations, it seems that the mask should operate primarily as a signal on the part of the wearer to those who she encounters that she is aware of the risk of asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic transmission of the disease and of the need to demonstrate respect for others through masking and maintaining distance. This can be certainly understood as a facet of good citizenship. And anthropologists David Inglis and Anna-Marie Almila make this clear, and this is a quote from them. Care of the self in turn melds into care for others. If the masked person understands their practice in light of certain kinds of medical evidence that they may have been exposed to, either through official channels or more informally, to the effect that donning a mask is more about oneself, not infecting others, rather than being protected from others. The latter is a form of mask-based citizenship practice. Now, I could also talk in terms of the fact that among scientists, including social scientists who discuss these matters, mask wearing remains quite a contested issue, even if it's now broadly spread amongst the public. Once one looks at both the positive and negative aspects of mask wearing. Overall, what seems to be required in terms of masks is a nuanced message about why communities mandate or advise the wearing of masks. In contexts where masks have been widely seen as symbols, often in the context of culture wars driven by populists, rather than simple tools to achieve a particular task, getting such a nuanced message across is by no means an easy task. It's made no easier by the fact that the publics have faced the so-called infodemic during the pandemic, making it ever harder to select key elements out of a wider noise in the context of the huge flood of not always reliable information that has become available on the internet and sometimes highly partisan news organizations. The broader public has been deluged by expressions of fact and expressions of opinion by experts. And it's not always easy to distinguish between the face covering in a generic sense and the face mask as a medical device. Now, this was the point at which I thought I'll rest my case. And then I started reading about masking in the United States. And then my head almost exploded because I realized how it was even more complex than I thought it was. Because these complexities that I've sketched radically underplay the dilemmas faced by one vulnerable group in relation to the issue of masking, namely Black men in the US. The dilemmas faced by this group highlight the need for analysis of COVID-19 that looks at all possible harms that both the diseases and the measures taken to combat its spread can cause. That is to say, we really need a synergistic analysis of the pandemic as syndemic, as I noted before, with multiple health-related socioeconomic and cultural consequences. Now, I'm only an amateur in the study of masking in the US, but it became immediately obvious just how complex these issues are, and complex and fraught these issues are. If you're a member of the Black community in the US, particularly if you're a Black man, decisions about whether or not to wear a mask decisions about whether or not to wear a mask need to be set against the backdrop of anti-mask laws, which are widespread across the US. Many of these were introduced ostensibly to combat the activities of the Ku Klux Klan and its highly visible and frightening masking practices. And in a US constitutional context, masking has rarely been accepted as protected speech or self-expression under the First Amendment. Anti-mask laws were adopted at the state level from the 1920s onwards, although there were already federal measures taken right after the Civil War. But these have never been effectively enforced by federal authorities. Anti-mask laws are often said to have been introduced in order to protect Black people against violence. But in fact, the widely accepted position is that these laws have generally been more frequently enforced against Black people, especially men, as one dimension of the many problematic state interventions that Black men experience against personal and bodily integrity. Anti-mask laws have been unevenly enforced, and in the context of systemic state and police violence against Black people, become one of the tools used against Black men to police their bodies. So, for example, they've been used as the basis for challenging Black men who are wearing hoodies that supposedly conceal their identity and thus lead them to be branded as gangsters or criminals. So replacing or supplementing an anti-mask law with a mask mandate is not going to provide a simple answer to the question of what measures are best to take in a pandemic to ensure optimal protection for this group. So there's anecdotal evidence that you can find in the US press that Black men find themselves simultaneously targeted by police for violating mask mandates and for violating anti-mask laws. They simply cannot win. Given that Black men are a group particularly vulnerable to catching COVID through higher risk of exposure or to suffering severe effects, including death from the disease, they are faced with a set of impossible choices. If they wear medical masks, there is the fear they will thereby be reducing the supply for healthcare workers. If they attempt to fashion their own homemade masks, as encouraged by many federal and state authorities, they are liable to be targeted by the police for taking steps to conceal their identity. What is innocent behavior in a white person is attributed a wholly different meaning when done by a Black person, especially a man. So just as anti-mask laws only ever superficially protected Black people, so mask mandates reveal themselves to be operating as contradictory instructions for individual and community protection for this same vulnerable group, struggling to be seen as citizens more than 150 years after the 14th Amendment. Thus, even a seemingly innocuous step intended to bring Americans together in the wake of a heavily contested presidential election, such as the call by Joe Biden and Kamala Harris for all Americans to wear masks for 100 days after their inauguration in January 2020, inevitably acquires different meanings in different communities within US society. And I make those points without then even discussing, although I could go on to discuss that, and I've written about it, the impact of Black Lives Matter and the killing of George Floyd in the Minneapolis by a Minneapolis police officer in May 2020, and the worldwide protest that spread as a result of that. But overall, what I want to point out is that the backdrop to the new norm of mask wearing is complex, contested, and necessarily context specific, highlighting the shifting meanings of the concept of constitutional citizenship. That is the place where the concept of where the constitutional norms and limits and conditions of polity membership intersect. It's clear that the global nature of the COVID-19 pandemic requires us to go beyond European or US practices, which I've concentrated on today, and to also look at the practice of mask wearing and its specific meanings in Asian countries, where wearing masks in certain circumstances has long been a cultural norm. Mask wearing, or its opposite, is historically, geographically, and culturally rooted, although change can happen quickly. In a matter of weeks, the meaning of the niqab can shift from a threatening veil to a valued face covering. And the supermarket that I go to regularly here in Edinburgh there are several Muslim women who work on the cash desks who regularly wear head coverings, and now they pull it across their face and pin it with something quite pretty, usually in order to complete the mask that they're required to wear as part of their employment. And because COVID makes you talk to people sometimes more than you would do otherwise, because you're starved of social interaction. I've asked a couple of them whether or not wearing it as a face covering, as a niqab, is common to them, and they say no. They've just chosen to do that as a way of complying with the current requirements. But it's interesting how that there is some very preliminary empirical evidence that I've read that indicates that there have been some changes in approach to wearing for Muslim women in wearing face coverings over the last few months. So mask wearing is, as I said, historically, geographically, and culturally rooted, and its meanings can shift very quickly. But other prejudgments, such as those about the threatening nature of Black males in the US, may not be shifted so easily by the changing meaning of the mask. One important conclusion to be drawn by the materials that I've been canvassing in this discussion, which can only touch the surface of a complex issue, concerns the need to proceed cautiously when suggesting how the mask forms part of the process of making and unmaking and remaking the good citizen across time and space. Masks have always been symbols and remain so even now, but at the same time, they may also be practical measures for disease mitigation. But they are not a great leveler, delivering us all equally from the pandemic, or at least from some of its risks, if worn more or less universally, even if this is what the epidemiological evidence broadly seems to suggest. In some, it is wrong to treat either mask wearers or non-wearers simply as symbols of good or evil, and to attach a conclusion that choosing to wear or not to wear a mask in any specific context is either conforming or deviant behavior. The process of being and remaining a citizen under conditions of equality and human dignity in a pandemic is simply too complex to be reduced to a straightforward calculus. And that's the end of my substantive presentation for today. The remaining slides on here represent a puff, an advertisement for my book, and the magnificent installation in front of Sydney Law School called Individuals, which is the inspiration for the cover of the book. This is my photograph. The photograph on the book cover is someone else's. And finally, just to invite you, should you want to continue the conversation, both to read the book, of course, to read the book, and to contact me by various different means. So thank you for your attention. It's been a pleasure for me.
Thank you, Joe, very much for this very thought-provoking take on constitutional rights and masks, and how an individual wearing a mask is also making a statement on his or her social relations, and the social aspect of citizenship is really important in these pandemic times. So I invite you now all for a discussion. I will kindly ask you to either use this button, raise hand, or to write your question here in the chat box. That would be, I think, the easiest way to do it. Please, don't be shy. Let's see, anyone? Anyone?
It seems that that the Zoom meeting is actually not more friendly; it's more intimidating than Zoom webinar.
Yeah, sometimes this happens. Okay, so we had the first question. Please unmute yourself.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
You talked about how like wearing masks can be looked at as like good or evil. Can you say more about that?
Yes, thank you. What I'm trying to suggest is that it isn't. There may be a tendency, but I think that the pandemic has not been good for us in terms of us wanting to, reduce everything to simple prescriptions, things that are good for us and things that are bad for us. What I was trying to show in the way that I presented the material was simply to illustrate how many different complex norms there are in relation to mask wearing. And if the bit of this that comes, if you will, from my book was the discussion of the burqa, which I used in I discussed quite extensively problems of that are faced when states, or in the case of Quebec, because it's also something that's happened at a sub-state level in Canada, in Quebec, that when the states or parts of states regulate, seek to regulate the burqa, they pose very significant questions about the balance between minority and majority cultures. And if you also can get, like, the legislature decides that that women should not wear the burqa, or face covering should not be held across the face in public, thus consequently facing particularly Muslim women with an invidious choice between, on the one hand, breaking the law or keeping out of the public sphere, because for them it's a very important part of their religious identity. So you have these ways of reconstructing citizenship, and it's connected to citizenship because in France, for example, and in a number of other countries, women who have refused to remove the burqa in public have been denied formal citizenship. So they're not only treated as lesser citizens in the sense that it's problematic for them to come into public without wearing their burqas, but they've actually been refused formal access to membership of the state, membership of the nation state in a number of countries. And that was my starting point. But then when you think about the way in which norms of wearing face coverings in under pandemic conditions has evolved, you realize that many things are being switched around. Our assumptions about what constitutes the good citizen in a majoritarian context are being switched around, because now the good citizen wears a mask and socially distances and doesn't cramp other people's space and doesn't seek to touch other people or breathe on them. But many of the people who reject that are not, although they may be a minority, they are often members of hegemonic majority groups. That is, to put it crudely, they are often white middle-aged men who refuse to wear masks on the grounds that to do otherwise would be to impinge upon their freedom. So that already turns that upside down and makes you think about a new way of thinking about what constitutes the good and the bad citizen. And in a sense, my argument sort of rested there until I started, as part of my research, to read about the politics of mask wearing in the United States. And that then became even more complicated because of the interface with the Ku Klux Klan, anti-mask wars, and so on and so forth. You're trying to keep Ivor off screen, are you there, Jelena?
Actually, Igor, who's also listening with his headphones on.
But it's probably sometimes difficult to tell the difference, isn't it?
All the time.
Anyway, so it becomes an even more complex set of social relationships, if you will, about what constitutes the good citizen. If you are if you're a black man in the US, so you're part of a dominant sex, you're a man, but as a black man, your bodily integrity is constantly being contested as a result of just the way that racial norms operate in the US. So that's what I'm trying to explain, and I'm not providing any answers. What I'm trying to say is that it's really complicated, and we definitely need nuanced public messages, and nuanced public messages are not what governments have been really good at giving in the last year or so that we've been living in pandemic conditions. Governments seem to want to give simple messages. They don't want to give nuanced messages, but we do need nuanced messages about issues like this. I hope that answers your question, Wu Chan.
Thank you.
We have two questions that are in a way related, because they pose this question of whether there is a difference between arguments based on expertise or medical expertise, or arguments based on cultural explanations. If you see, because Gazella asked, what is the role of expertise in pursuing policies on wearing masks? So is it a question which is not solely cultural? So there's an implication that experts' opinion is more important than. And then the other question is, do you think states like Canada and France will become more tolerant for religious dress in the post-pandemic world? So there's this cultural argumentation versus expertise arguments when wearing masks.
Sorry, I just did something. Am I still there? Yes. Sorry, that was me fiddling around with my. Yeah. So those are both really interesting questions, and I suppose that I thought that it wasn't very complicated if you started looking at mask wearing. Of course, it's obvious that wearing a mask. Well, yes, I think at two levels it's quite simple. I mean, for the majority of people, it's really quite simple just to wear a mask, yeah. And at the societal level, it's undoubtedly a good thing to limit contacts between humans. But in fact, if you look at the scientific debate, and I haven't looked at too much of it, but what I've tried to read is some like systematic reviews that this is very common in science communication, that somebody will take all of the studies and then draw out the key points in a systematic review. If you look at those, there's actually more equivocation amongst scientists than what one would expect, and that then sort of makes one realize that perhaps science communication and broader cultural communication, if you will, are not so separate, or political communication are not so separate as one might think. It isn't like A and B, or to use a comparison like black and white, which I don't like to do because of the racial connotations, but or light and dark. It's not the case that science communication is clear and unequivocal, and then political communication is a bit messy and muddy. In fact, the messages from science communication about masks can be they can be contested because scientists disagree about these things, and that's right that they should disagree. But they're also equivocated in the sense that those who try to argue that mask wearing, you have to weigh up the balance, the balance and the harm that it can cause. So, do, for example, people who are wearing masks get too close to other people? And if they're wearing homemade masks because they think they're safe, or they think that they aren't emitting in the same way, it would be better that they were standing at a proper 2 meters without wearing masks than that they get too close wearing a mask, and actually they can transmit the disease. So I've become, as a consequence of the material I've read for this, more more equivocal, if you will, about the distinction between expertise and broader sort of political decision making about these questions, which is why I keep coming back to the fact that around mask wearing, then what you do need is a nuanced message that recognizes difference and recognizes that there are people who literally count for a variety of reasons, including for disabilities, that the reasons of disabilities that are not visible, comfortably wear masks. Now, Ashley asks whether or not states like Canada, well, Canada, she'll know more about than I will do, whether states like Canada might become, and France might become more tolerant. The leitmotif might be to see what happens in this upcoming Swiss referendum on the wearing of the burqa, where this has been raised by a right-wing political party to have a national referendum on whether or not the burqa should be banned. I think it'll give us the only evidence that we have as to whether or not these types of whether the fact that many people have been wearing masks, are they then going to go out and vote to say that, you know, Muslim women should not wear the burqa, and that we can somehow clearly distinguish between medical devices, for which there is an exception in the referendum proposal, and you know, religious dress, if you will. So it'll be interesting. I think that's the only way that we might get some. I don't want to speculate as to whether people might become more tolerant. I mean, I like to think that our exposure to the pandemic should make us raise questions about things that we've taken for granted. But I find it very hard to speculate. But I will be very interested to see what happens with the Swiss referendum, which is coming up in a matter of days or at most weeks. I can't remember exactly what date it is, possibly even still in February.
Now Gordon has a question. Please unmute yourself.
Okay.
Hello.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask a question related to your last slide. The first statement on your last slide was that the issue of mask is contested and context specific.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I agree completely. But then in the next statement, you plead for a necessity or need for a global perspective. I mean, how do you imagine a global perspective? I don't deny necessity for a global perspective, but I would be interested to know how to imagine a global perspective in a world which is more and more fragmented, divided. I mean, within society, one society, and even more in relations among societies. I think we are even more away from any possibility to build something in common, universal. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gordana. I think that's a good question, and it's possible that I've not been as clear as I could be with this. So when I say a global perspective, I don't mean a single global perspective. What I'm trying to say is that when we add more data to our understanding of what the meaning of masking or face covering is, the more data we add to it, the more complex, the more contested it becomes, and the different types of social meanings that emerge. So I'm absolutely not asking for a single role. You know, I mean, the WHO can be very positive, as it has been, about mask wearing, about wearing face coverings as a risk mitigation strategy. But my argument here is actually not global in the sense of saying there's a single perspective. What I'm trying to say is that we don't get a broader perspective until we add more types of case studies that will widen out our understanding, because we'll learn more about other different places and cultures and the way in which mask wearing has been constructed in that context. And then once we've done that, we can reflect back on what the assumptions are that built our approach to that in the first place. That is, you know, probably a lot of people in this Zoom, when they were first asked to wear a face covering and to go outside or to go in a shop, probably reacted to that as in quite a negative way. So one of the ways in which we can reconstruct the types of and put in question the assumptions that we make is by understanding more about the complexity of mask wearing right across human cultures and across, if you will, global society. I'm absolutely not pleading for a single approach by any stretch of the imagination. I'm arguing precisely for a more nuanced messages to be given to people to understand what the meaning of masking is in particular contexts.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? So you either raise your hand or just type your question here in the box. Okay. So,
yeah, I can see there's a question from Sonmez.
What happens to non-citizens? Right?
Yeah. Okay. This is a really interesting question because in a sense I'm dodging around that question. I guess everyone can see it, but I'll read it out in any case because not everybody is probably looking at chat. What happens to non-citizens? For instance, states do not feel responsible for vaccination of non-citizens living in their territories. So while answering the question of who the pandemic citizen is, where and how do we locate non-citizens? And this, of course, raises this complex issue about citizenship, that it's both as it were a formal status, but it's also a more holistic concept of membership in the sense that it may include in different contexts, not just those who actually have formal membership, but also those who are residents or those who are there even without lawful cause. And that comes out, I think, particularly at pressure points, because the pandemic, you know, the vaccination will only work as a strategy if it's reasonably effective at the micro level. That is, the vaccines themselves are reasonably effective, but that the percentages of populations that are vaccinated are high enough in order to achieve something like the famed herd immunity, which has become such a problematic phrasing. Now, I haven't yet looked at vaccination strategies in detail, but it seems to me to be part of a very important part of another chapter, if you will, within this project, which is to consider firstly to gain more information about how states are approaching this question, and to consider non-citizens, because it seems to me that there are a number of important challenges going on here. One is that if you're treating states as quite anatomistic and quite closed off from each other, which they are in practice in large measure at the moment, because freedom of movement is massively reduced, and the normal incidents of migration are much lower than they were in February 2020 when this all kicked off. So you've got the question of, within those territories, in order to have an effective vaccination strategy, not including non-citizens is bonkers. And the UK is absolutely including non-citizens and including and also approaching it in a non-judgmental way, so that, for example, those who don't have leave to be in the UK may actually have a doctor's registration, and that's enough to get you a vaccine. And I think that there will be various steps taken to ensure that everyone is reached. But I don't deny that in many countries this is going to be a problem, and it's going to reduce the effectiveness of vaccination strategies. But the other way of looking at non-membership is not to look, as it were, at the group of residents within the state, is to look also across states, and to look at the absurd vaccine nationalism that has been dominating practices, or vaccine diplomacy, as I gather Serbia has benefited from. So you have various ways in which vaccines are being used across the community of states, and it's clear that as a globe, this is an area where we do need a global approach. I mean, I wasn't calling for a single global approach to mask wearing, but when it comes to the vaccine, we absolutely do need a global approach, and to get vaccines out to all states, all societies on a cost-effective basis. So thank you for drawing our attention to the issues of membership, non-membership. And as I say, my main sort of note here would be to say we need to think about that both within states and also on a trans-state, transnational basis as well.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? So you can raise hand or write in the chat. I have just some final, maybe, it's not a question. I was just thinking about some things. I was thinking about when you talked about the history of in different contexts of wearing masks, how there's obviously there's a socio-historical background to practices of mask wearing, and there's also political context of either banning mask or encouraging mask wearing. But now we have this peculiar situation. We have a context on its own, the pandemic. And then obviously it's also within this context, this other context resonate. I mean, the layers of socio-historic context of mask wearing. But there's also, I mean, there's many peculiarities about mask wearing in the situation of pandemic, because first of all, the motive for wearing them comes externally. I mean, it's the virus came, the external threat came, so there's the motivation is to protect ourselves and to protect others. Whereas when we mask ourselves because we want to, when we wear burqas or niqabs, it's internally in a way that, I mean, the motivation comes from within our culture, from within how we perceive our identity. So the norm, the place where the norm comes is different, external or internal place. And there's also, with masks, there's this sort of an attempt at leveling. I mean, all have to wear masks, right? That's the norm. Whereas with burqas or with some other face covering techniques or practices, cultural practices, it's either some population, or it's either women, or it's or some groups are they need to. So there's an exemption, and there's also marking of identity in a way. So there's these different layers. But also wearing a mask in the context of pandemic, it's becoming a social act of showing solidarity and responsibility, for example. But sometimes refusal to wear a mask is also interpreted as a social act of not letting the government interfere with my freedom.
Exactly.
So it's it can be read in at this. So it's very interesting when you have all these layers, when you have how to read this and how to put wearing masks in the time of pandemic, how to put it in the context of masking in general. I mean, because we have all these different ways of reading it, whether the norm comes externally or internally, whether we demand something from everyone or only from parts of populations. And also the question of trust that Gazelle also asked, but it's not only that you have to wear a mask because state authority tells you that you have to do it. I mean, it becomes obligatory and you have to do it. It becomes a duty of citizenship. But people also wear masks because they trust authorities or expert communities who told them to wear masks, or they don't wear masks because they trust some other expert community who tell them that it's bad for their, I don't know, it reduces oxygen or whatever, because you have that kind of experts as well. So the issue of trust is also there, and it creates also this mask wearing communities and communities that refuse to wear masks. They kind of create new communities of citizenship again. So that's also some it's not, I don't really have a question. I was just thinking about all these different ways how to complicate further this issue.
You certainly do. I think you've pointed out many different ways in which I probably ought to develop this in order to before I go ahead and try and publish it. It's got a long way to go before then. I've got a lot of material, but I think much of it is incomplete when it comes to reflecting on all of those different sorts of issues. So I was frantically taking some notes whilst you were talking there for your helpful little mini lecture that really helps me.
Any final questions? Anyone? If not, I want to thank you all for being here with us, and especially to you, Joshua. Thank you very much. It was
thank you.
Really, really interesting, and I hope we'll have you here soon in person.
I would very much like
without masks. With or without masks.
Well, I don't mind. I think mask wearing is here for the foreseeable future. But
yes, that's true.
I've pretty much got used to that. But thank you very much for the opportunity to present, and also for the excellent and interesting questions.
Thank you. Thank you.